Good evening and welcome. My name is John Aggleton. I'm president of the British Neuroscience Association, and I'm delighted both that we're hosting this public lecture. I'm delighted by the topic, and I'm particularly delighted by the speaker. I should explain that my interest is in learning and memory, but in neural brain systems, mechanisms of learning and memory. And one of the frustrations for people who work on such mechanisms has often been the lack of transposition of our understanding about what the brain does and how it works to applying it to incredibly, unbelievably important issues like how do we transfer that knowledge to best practice in education and learning. This is an area of incredible importance. It's so obvious that it is, but it's remarkable how long it's taken us to realize that we need to do this, and it's remarkable that we are only sort of tentatively making steps forward. And at the same time, we have to dispel the various myths that are out there about how education can work from the brain when people are just saying inaccurate things about the brain. Thankfully for us, there are people who do work on this area and people who are really trying to push back both our knowledge and ignorance in this area. And as I said, I think this is self-evident, but it's an incredibly important topic for all of us. So our speaker is Professor Paul Howard-Jones. He's at the University of, and he may be well known to you for his television appearances, in particular for The Secret Life of 4-, 5- and 6-year-olds, which have given viewers insights into the minds of children as they make early forays into the world and relationship about them. His actual day job is Professor of Neuroscience and Education at the University of Bristol. His research explores the benefits offered to education by emerging technologies aided by insight into underlying cognitive processes. And for those reasons, he really is the perfect person to talk to you about neuroscience and education, perils and promises. So, Paul, thank you so much for coming and giving this talk.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much. Yes, so it's University of Bristol. I think I just left it off because I like to keep my options open. So if anybody wants to, I'm always available. Neuroscience and education. There's been a discussion now going on for probably about 10 or 20 years about how this should happen. And I sometimes think of it as, it's like a first date, maybe. I don't know. A romantic meal for two. I don't know which one's neuroscience and which one's education, but how these two should get along together. And perhaps, especially, what's on the menu? How should we proceed in this? And you could sort of characterize this very roughly in maybe three different directions. There are some people that feel all they really want, and I get quite a few emails actually from people asking me, you do neuroscience, can you just approve our product? Can you say that from a neuroscience point of view, this is a really good product? Because if you can give it a neuroscience tick, it's really going to sell and it's going to make a lot of money. It's not a very good idea, really, and there's a sense in which neuroscience alone really cannot dictate or provide prescriptions to education. There's no way to go straight from brain scan to lesson plan. We really do need the understanding of educators and the expertise within education to be able to make a sensible interpretation of what neuroscience means for the classroom. And then there are others who think actually neuroscience should just stay out of the picture entirely. And I remember the first time I stood up at an education conference and said, I'm going to be using neuroimaging to understand more about creativity in the classroom. Somebody standing up at the back and saying, but you're just siding with the rat torturers, which was kind of disturbing. I was suddenly being identified with a completely new system of beliefs. I said I was vegetarian, which seemed to sort of calm things down somehow. So there are some people that just think, this is all about people with white coats coming in and dictating, and they just want to keep it out. And neuroscience has a real authority. I think you're probably aware of that, many of you. Educational research is sometimes referred to as part of the dreaded blob, really, and just, sort of gets in the way. So, there's a friction, and some people feel threatened, I think, by neuroscience and would rather keep it out of education. And then there's the idea that these two things should really work together collaboratively in some way, but we're still working out how that's supposed to happen. But let's just take the neuroscience-free option, because in a way that's sort of what we've had for the last few decades. And if you look at some of the ideas that have arisen in that period, it gives you a good idea of why neuroscience-free, the idea of just not mentioning neuroscience to teachers, can actually be a bad idea. So this is a survey, well, it's a collection of surveys, really, that we did, myself and several collaborators, identifying neuro myths around the world. It's something that was published in Nature Reviews Neuroscience a couple of years ago. And all of these things are, I'll just check actually, I've got this right, because there's several versions of this questionnaire, but yes, all of these things are essentially myths. But you can see the high percentages in the different countries, UK, Netherlands, Turkey, Greece, and China, that really, these are all percentages of teachers who believe in these ideas. But you know, the idea that we only use 10% of our brain, it's really not true. We use all our brain is functioning all the time unless you have a serious medical condition. This one is perhaps the worst one of all in terms of the way in which it is spread. The idea that you can teach somebody in a preferred learning style and that's going to improve their learning, it's very, very popular around the world. Coordination exercises, improving right brain hemispheric integration. This is something from Brain Gym. Hemispheric dominance, whether you're a left brain thinker or a right brain thinker. Some of them are less obvious. Children being less attentive after sugary drinks and snacks. And actually the evidence is a little bit more in the other direction. They can be a little bit more attentive. And this is a very odd one. Drinking less than 6 to 8 glasses of water a day can cause your brain to shrink. This is something I'd sort of heard teachers saying, and I thought, well, I'll put it in the survey. I didn't expect many people to sign up to it, but actually in the UK in particular, we've got a lot of teachers who believe that, possibly generated by water companies, and there's a sort of hysteria, I think, sometimes you can see amongst mums, you know, who are saying, and dads, who are saying, you know, cling on to that water bottle, darling. How much water have you had today? You know, and monitoring water intake all the time. We'll deal with these in a little bit more detail. But I think one of them, this one here, it's worth pointing out because it's a little bit more insidious. Learning problems associated with developmental differences in brain function cannot be remediated by education. So there is this idea that once something's associated with the brain, it's biologically determined and there's very little you can do about it except pass maybe the issue on to medicine. It sort of medicalizes it once something starts becoming associated with the brain. And you know, there's more and more dyslexia research, more and more research in a variety of different developmental disorders that use brain imaging and images of the brain in order to explain what's going on. And it's kind of worrying that once you get that association, because people don't always understand that those differences in brain function can come about also through environment as well as biological genetic issues, it immediately becomes more determined and there's less that you can do about it, and the agency of the teacher is somehow reduced. So let's just go through some of these. Where do they come from? Well, there are a lot of people who peddle them and actually make money out of it. They wanted to video me today, and I said, yeah, you can video me, but please don't video the slides because... Actually, that's a reminder, because, you know, a lot of these companies are quite litigious and they make money out of selling these ideas. And so when people come along and criticize, they can get quite upset. So when I produced an article about Brain Gym in the Times Educational Supplement, it had to go through 2 teams of lawyers before it was allowed to be published. Such are the commercial interests that are involved in these companies that sell brain-based ideas. One of the most popular ones is learning styles. Are you a visual learner, an auditory learner, or a kinesthetic learner? I've put here like MI theory, because you might also heard of multiple intelligences theory. But these things are quite often used to categorize learners, and then the teacher is encouraged to teach somebody in a particular learning style. Often with this biological justification, well, the brain has an auditory cortex, a visual cortex, you know, therefore they're bound, you know, they might be different, and so people will be processing information in different ways. But actually the brain is very interconnected, so there's not really a strong neural brain basis for arguing this. And in fact, psychologists who have carried out controlled experiments have decided that this idea of identifying people in a particular style and then teaching or delivering information in that style, it really is a wasted effort. And there's been a lot of educational research, a review of which has concluded that really there's very little convincing evidence that this is helpful. And it's a lot of work for teachers. So, you know, you are looking at a waste of money and time, even if it has zero effect. Brain gym has been described as barkingly out to lunch. That you may recognise if I don't know if you've ever been to school or when you were at school, you ever were encouraged to do these strange things. The science behind brain gym is very odd. It's not really recognisable as established science. The idea is that you have two brain buttons here and you rub them, and that helps integrate your left and right hemisphere. I remember Colin Blakemore on Newsnight describing this as like rubbing your central heating, or rubbing your radiator to fix your central heating. It's extremely unlikely to work, but nevertheless, it's very attractive. And this sort of, emotional bias, that wishful thinking, the idea that this could somehow work, it sort of draws you in, kind of. And just as I was doing that, I saw a lot of people having a little rub there, just hopefully that it might make you feel a bit more integrated in terms of your hemispheres. Omega-3 is another very popular idea. I get a lot of my Neuro Myth evidence from BBC Online. This is one of their stories. Elliot's 9 years old. He's falling behind, crashing on the sofa to watch TV when he gets home from school. I do think a lot of children do that. But over the past year, there's been a dramatic change. He's soaring through the Harry Potter books, apparently because he's taking fish oils. The evidence for this, there have been studies that have been done with children with developmental disorders. It's about 50-50. Some of them show positive effects, some don't. But amongst the mainstream, amongst the general population, the studies that have been done, and there have been two recently, really show very little convincing evidence that there's any effect, which is a shame because it's such an attractive idea to think you can go out and buy some supplements and they're going to make you clever. Actually, fish oils and omega-3 very important and healthy for a number of other reasons, and I take them, but I have no hope that they're going to make me more clever, sadly, because really the only evidence we have is quite circumstantial evidence. For example, prenatal maternal fish consumption is associated with higher IQs in the children, but in the children that are born later. But I think one of the problems here is that the idea of maternal fish consumption feeding into the development of a child in embryo is actually very different to the hope that taking supplements as pills when you're older is somehow going to have an effect. It takes a very long time for that supplement to turn into the sorts of omega-3 traces that are observed and measurable in the brain. So generally speaking, no conclusive research for the general population, but it misses the point that actually there is a big nutritional issue in terms of education, and it's breakfast. Breakfast is the #1 nutritional issue that affects learning in schools, and if you're a parent of a teenager, and before I was a parent of a teenager, I couldn't understand why parents would send their children out without breakfast. I thought it was absolutely appalling. Now I've had several teenagers and I've tried to bring them up, I realise what you're up against and why teenagers end up at school not having had any breakfast. It's hard enough to get them out of bed quite often. So that's the nutritional issue we should be focusing on. Another one is water. By the way, this comes from Brain Gym again. There's a little tune here. You should sing it to Ferajaka. The children are encouraged to sing it. Let's drink water, I love water, it gives me energy. Ironically, of course, it's one of the few things that you could ingest that has no calorific content whatsoever. But, it's promoted, it's kind of attractive in its own way, and there is evidence to show that when you've had a drink of water, if you're a little bit dehydrated, because dehydration does lower your cognitive function, then that can be really helpful. But there's also evidence to show that when you have a drink of water and you're not dehydrated, you're not thirsty, that can also lower your cognitive function, although why that is more unclear. Nevertheless, there are lots of articles, BBC Online coming through again here, Water Improves Test Results, publicising this idea, because it's fantastic. The idea you could just put water coolers into a school and somehow see an improvement in GCSE grades. That's such an attractive idea, isn't it? But in fact, there have been very few studies of voluntary dehydration in the classroom, and really none that show it occurring, none showing any sort of a problem, except in one of the hottest areas of the world, in the Dead Sea area, where children were shown not to be drinking enough water and it was affecting their cognitive function. No evidence of voluntary dehydration in schools anywhere else in the world, no evidence of academic achievement related to drinking water. We do know mild dehydration can reduce cognitive function. We know, that there is a particular problem when things are unusually hot or when children have been taking exercise. So there is an issue on sports days in particular, when you can get heat and exercise combined. There really is a need to monitor children's intake of water. But if we're talking about healthy children in a temperate climate, when they've got access to drinking water, good quality drinking water, it's really a matter of just responding to thirst. Caffeine, it is more of an issue. There are studies that show children 9 to 10 years old, for example, regular consumers, and we're only talking about 2 cans a day, their baseline cognitive function is reduced, and they only go back up to what they were before when they've had their caffeine fix. And this is something we see with adult tea drinkers and coffee drinkers as well. You might think that coffee and tea is making you, is improving your cognitive function, making you more alert, but sadly what happens is that actually after a while, when you're habituated to it, it reduces it, and you're only going back up to baseline when you've had your fix. I gave up caffeine a couple of years ago because I was always banging on about this to my students and to schools when they asked me to talk to schools, but I was still drinking my tea. And I was amazed by the effect that it had on me. And first of all, I was impressed by the negative effects it had on me when I was trying to give up. I had possibly the most middle-class addiction in the world. I was addicted to Earl Grey tea. Yeah, my name is Paul. I was an Earl Grey tea addict. I thought, well, it's Earl Grey tea. How can that help? How can that hurt me? How can it hurt me? And then I was really started observing myself. And I think it was one night when I lay in bed with my second cup of tea in bed, and then waking up feeling like a cup of tea in the middle of the night, and then first thing in the morning not being able to get out of bed without a cup of Earl Grey tea, and counting up to the fact that I was having 20 cups of Earl Grey tea, I began to realize that maybe I did have a problem. 2 weeks of headaches and nausea and just the most grumpiest dad ever, I began to feel a little bit better. But because of that awful experience of kicking it, I've got to say, I've got no intentions of going back. Just try it. So if you're a caffeine drinker, just try giving up for a few days and see what the effect is. It can really make you think about what you're doing. Those are the more sort of simple things that are more easy to sort out because it comes down to sort of simple facts, if you like. Perhaps one of the more worrying ways in which neuroscience can be a source of confusion are in these more complex areas. And we know from neuroscience and from behavioral studies that we have sensitive periods in our development when we are more able to learn in certain ways, and after we've left those periods of time, less able to learn. And that idea about sensitive periods has combined perhaps with an intuitive sense that infants, are very special, and they are very special, and that the early years is a very important time for learning, which it is. And that's sometimes produced a very sort of deterministic way of looking at brain development. And I have to sort of point the finger a little bit at Hillary Clinton here, who said, it is clear that by the time most children start preschool, the architecture of the brain has essentially been constructed. We know that's very much not true, that brain development continues in waves of proliferation of connections and pruning back of connections until about 19 years old. Nevertheless, it's given rise to this very simple principle of learning based around this idea that learning begets learning. Now, as a vicar's son, I'm very familiar with this idea. It's in Matthew. To he who hath shall more be given. To he who hath not, even what he hath shall be taken from him. I always remember that, thinking, that's a really sort of quite a harsh depiction of reality. But it's the basis of this idea, and there is some common sense feel to it that learning builds on other learning. And so it makes sense in a way that the more you learn, the more you're able to learn. And that is true, but it's not all about that. There are other issues of development that make brain development and our ability to learn much more complex than can possibly be expressed in that simple phrase. The trouble is that has given rise to models of educational investment, apparently backed by neuroscience, that have been used to withdraw higher education funding. And you can find documents that make reference to neuroscience as a support for saying, look, it doesn't make any difference how much you invest in higher education. It doesn't really come back to the state because the brain is essentially fixed by then, and therefore we should be putting all our money into the early years. Early years, let me say, is a really important time for investment, but actually, later in life is also important. But this sort of graph became very popular for a couple of decades, representing Heckman economics. And this graph, actually, you can generate very easily. Just use the concept that your return on investment occurs within a limited lifespan. And it's kind of like, well, think about it as if the interest rate that your bank is offering you is actually proportional, the percent that you're getting is proportional to how much money you've got in the bank. Because that's the learning begets learning principle. The more you have, the more you get back. And that's what generates this graph. And it's really quite impressive in terms of demonstrating how important early investment is, because it's saying, look, after the age of 3, really, you're not getting a great return. But it's an oversimplification because the idea of sensitive periods is very much about normal and abnormal development. And whereas it's true that if a child has received harsh conditions, harsh environmental conditions, or has been disadvantaged genetically, then early intervention really can be very, very important in terms of righting that wrong, if you like. And sensitive periods become a relevant concept when thinking about that, but it doesn't mean that hothousing middle-class children and investing the same amount of money for them is going to produce a similar increase in improvement. So it doesn't differentiate between typical and atypical development experience or genetic background. And also, the model assumes a single type of accumulating cognitive ability. And actually, human development and learning is not like that. There are certain parts of the brain that come on stream at different stages. So, for example, during adolescence, there's good evidence to suggest that identity starts becoming a very important issue. And there are brain regions associated with identity that are still developing, and therefore it's quite reasonable to predict that we are going to find sensitive periods related to adolescent identity formation at some point in the future. Just because we haven't got that evidence now, and most of our evidence is from sensitive periods in the early years, doesn't mean that sensitive periods only exist in the early years. So, really, it's kind of worrying when policymakers do this sort of thing, where they draw the Heckman graph like this, and they draw over it where our educational investment is. And you can sort of see there's a very clear message here that we should be shifting, instead of shifting, a lot of this area here to the earlier years. I'm all for increasing investment in education, but I think we have to be very careful of these sort of simplistic models of economic investment that claim to be based on neuroscience, but actually are based on a very simplistic model of brain development. So, that's, if you like, one of the more complex myths that's entered the political bloodstream. Where do these myths come from? Well, to my mind, I think a lot of it has to do with this cultural gap between neuroscience and education. Different languages, different concepts, different professional aims, they're not really talking to each other. So when claims arise that relate neuroscience and education together, it's quite difficult to find authoritative voices who actually want to talk about them in an evidence-based way. There's usually some sort of seed that starts the myth off, which has some scientific basis to it. So these things don't spring out of thin air. If you look at every neuromyth, there's usually some little seed of truth that has been distorted out of all proportion. And then what forms the shape of the neuromyth are these biases. We have these emotional biases, we get anxious, we want to think we've got an easy solution, and then we have a developmental bias that tends to cause us to think about the mind and the brain as less related to each other than they really are. Now, you may be wondering where that caterpillar's come from. I can see some people going, there's a caterpillar up there. I stole some part of this slide from a GIF. I think it was the plant, and I didn't realize there was a caterpillar on there. So every time I put this slide up, people are saying, there's a caterpillar on the top. And I always forget to remove it. Anyway, so every myth has some seed, usually, of truth. It's true that learners benefit from receiving information in a variety of different modalities. It's not true that they benefit from having their learning style identified and just having information delivered in a visual, auditory, or kinesthetic manner. It's true that language is generally left lateralized, but it's not true it's helpful to categorize learners as left-brained or right-brained. It's true that dehydration can reduce cognitive function, even mild dehydration, but it's not true that our brain's going to shrink if we don't drink 6 to 8 glasses of water a day. Aerobic exercise is good for the brain. It can improve mental function and our ability to learn, but motor coordination exercises and lazy 8s and the sorts of things that some programs encourage you to do are not going to improve literacy. The younger brain is more plastic, but the trajectory of brain development is not fixed at 3 years old. So is he still there? Yes, he is. I can see him on the top. So really, one way of solving these misunderstandings would be to have greater collaboration between neuroscience and education, including neuroscience into the educational dialogue. How far are we from doing that? Are there insights in a positive way? Are there insights that are coming through from neuroscience now that we could apply in education? I'll whiz through some of them very briefly. First of all, we're becoming aware of the fact that there are core quantity abilities, core abilities that develop very early on that enable us to sense quantity. And those appear to be very important for our development of formal mathematical understanding. So if you ask people to do formal maths, you might see, exact calculations. You might see left hemisphere regions involved because they're thinking it through in language internally. But when you ask them to make an approximation, you see these yellow regions activating, which are more to do with this primitive sense of quantity, which we think is quite important for learning the meaning of numbers. And that has some implications for some interventions that are now being trialled. We're also beginning to understand about the emotional content of learning and about how maths anxiety in particular displaces your working memory capacity and makes it more difficult for you to consciously attend even to what you do actually know already. And therefore, maths test anxiety is not really testing, it stops the child from actually performing mathematically. It stops them from applying what they already know and is therefore a significant barrier to learning. And neuroscience is feeding into that by helping us see the effects of maths anxiety using neuroimaging when children and young adults are trying to solve problems. Mental rotation, we're beginning to understand that has some significance in terms of mathematical and engineering skills and how that can be trained. Also, mathematics, I talked about this physical sense of number as being important for giving meaning physical sense of quantity being important for giving meaning to number. It's a matter of making that relationship between the symbols that you see and actually that sense of quantity. And one way in which you can improve that is by training children to express number on a number line like this. And this is one intervention that was done which encouraged young learners, some of whom had been diagnosed with dyscalculia, which is a difficulty with numbers, encourage them to express their answer to simple sums by landing a spaceship on a number line. And of course, when you do that, you're encouraging them to think about a physical representation of that quantity. And what was found was that there was improvements in efficiency in terms of functioning of brain regions amongst the dyscalculia group and an improvement in their quantity processing skills, but also amongst the normal, well, inverted commas, normal children as well. which is what you'd expect, because one of the things that's interesting about the neuroscience perspective, the biological perspective of learning, is that for many of these disorders, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, it's not providing us with a clear qualitative difference between children with those diagnoses and children without. It does appear to be a difference on a normal range, if you like. So you would expect, therefore, interventions that work for children with a diagnosis of dyslexia or dyscalculia, those interventions to work also for children without those diagnoses. In reading, we understand that there are reading is about coding language in many different respects, coding it orthographically in terms of how it's represented in writing, phonologically in terms of sound, but also its meaning as well. And there are different regions of the brain associated with those different ways of coding language. And in reading, they all come into play, and they're all very importantly interconnected with each other. And that means that we can, with some interventions, actually show how those different regions mature as a result of that intervention. So this is the visual word form area here, which becomes more sensitive to print as children learn to read. And as children became more proficient at mapping sounds to letters in this game called Graphagame, so we see an improvement in activity in the visual word form area that correlates with that improvement. It's almost like we have a neural marker, if you like, for the effectiveness of this software, which then raises interesting prospects in terms of using neuroimaging as a way of as a design tool for improving educational software, perhaps. But of course, reading is not just about phonology, although arguably phonology may be the most important thing. It's a multi-component process, amenable to multi-component interventions that take into account not just phonics, but morphological knowledge, different parts of speech, different multiple meanings, spelling patterns, and possibly it is a possibility that neuroscience may help us understand individual differences more clearly and possibly tailor interventions to specific learners with specific deficiencies in these different areas. Exercise, we're beginning to understand more about the importance of exercise for learning, how exercise enhances executive control functions, and even short interventions like this, where you've got like 30 minutes of physical exercise with teenagers in a class, appears to improve their cognitive function afterwards. There's some evidence now linking this to academic achievement as well, which I was listening to today, which is very interesting. And if you look at all the exercise interventions that have been done in schools, it's quite interesting because inevitably it means if you're going to devote more time to exercise, you're devoting less time to the curriculum. So you might expect to see some with a negative impact on academic achievement, but instead you see half of these interventions producing a positive impact on academic achievement and half of them producing no impact at all. So overall, that tends to suggest if you get the right exercise regime, and we're doing it in the right way, and there's all sorts of questions about that at the moment, but if you can get the right exercise regime, it will improve academic achievement. Teenage lifestyle is a big one. I was mentioning my teenagers earlier. Yes, I mean, we know that at a particular point in time, circadian rhythms will, for biological developmental regions, start becoming a little bit more detached from the night-day cycle, and that's going to cause teenagers to want to sleep later in the morning and go to bed later at nights. But it's also, of course, exacerbated by the fact they have more freedom and their friends are doing things. And they've also got this stuff, they've got the technology. Well, that seems a bit out of date now. It's much smaller than that, I'm sure. And, if teenagers text at night, we know they're 4 times more likely, let me say, text after lights out, they're 4 times more likely to experience sleepiness the next day. And so technology, but also caffeine are the 2 lifestyle issues that most appear to impact on teenage sleeplessness. And we know at night from this, for example, this is a study that shows how this is activity during the daytime, this is activity during the night, and the similarity between those activities is taken as evidence that you tend to replay your experiences during wakefulness at night in your cortex, and that's part of the consolidation processes that helps you remember them. So if you don't have proper quality sleep, you're going to remember less about what you experienced that day, as well as being more sleepy the next day. So it's a double whammy. And so there is really a need to try to find a way of getting through to these teenagers and getting them to bed earlier, putting down their technology, not drinking a can of Coca-Cola before they go to bed, and getting a good night's sleep. I mean, these products, without mentioning it by name, that product there actually contains the similar amount to like 3 cups of coffee. You only have to have 1 of those a day to be a regular user of caffeine, such that your cognitive function will be depressed. And I love this study. It's a very small scale study. I wish there were more like it, but it really does sort of demonstrate to me the potential impact of combining teenagers with technology. That's one of my a teenager of mine when he was a bit younger. And in this study, they had 13 to 14-year-olds doing 3 different types of things between 6 and 7 o'clock. Either they had no technology, or they played computer games, or they watched TV. Now, just playing computer games between 6 and 7 in an evening, I think that's a very structured evening, I have to say, compared with some of the issues that I have to cope with in my house. But nevertheless, it showed an impact on their sleep quality, because the type of sleep we're particularly interested in terms of consolidating memory, is slow wave sleep. And you can see that this is the percentage of slow wave sleep that those children experienced. In the basal conditions, when they're not having any technology, the most amount. But then in the television condition, you can see they've got less, and the least slow wave sleep when they've been playing computer games between 6 and 7. After that condition, after that 6 to 7 experience, they also did a pseudo homework task, which they were tested on the next day. And you can see that the percentage of memory loss reflects very nicely the amount of slow wave sleep loss. You can see that there was least memory loss in the basal conditions. There was more sleep loss in the TV condition, and most memory loss if they've been playing computer games between 6 and 7 in the evening. We don't know how much memory loss there would have been if they'd been playing computer games between 8 and 10 o'clock at night, for example. My guess is a little bit more than that, but we don't have that data. I would love to see more studies like that. What can we do about this? Well, unfortunately, simply providing information to teenagers about sleep just seems to make them very knowledgeable about sleep and sleep loss. It doesn't seem to affect their lifestyle at all, which is a bit of a disappointment. There has been some tentative evidence to show that when you become a little bit more, let's say, intrusive with the intervention, so that you're phoning them up and you're putting up fridge stickers and you're getting their friends to talk about it in focus groups, that can begin to make a bit of a difference to their lifestyle. But it's obviously not going to be very straightforward, this trying to get teenagers to organise their lifestyle. Genetics is an interesting area. Work, for example, by Robert Plomin has demonstrated how much, more than half, in fact, of the variance in children's reading skills, speaking skills, writing skills is explained by their genetic background. But actually, these types of very complex behaviors are the result of the interaction of many, many genes with each other and with the environment. And therefore, probably it's going to be unlikely to see individual genes that we can identify as being, as playing a major role in these things, because it's going to be a polygenetic issue with many different genes involved. However, there are some simple markers like the DRD47 repeat allele, which has been associated with some interesting effects, and there's some discussion about whether this in fact helps you identify whether a child is an orchid or a dandelion. I mean, you may have heard me talking about this on the Secret Lives documentary. There's quite a lot of pressure on me to talk about it, and I wasn't really very sure about the concept, I've got to admit. So I'm a little bit skeptical about this. But the idea is that you can according to your genetic background, you can be identified as being someone who is generally sensitive to the world. So if you're having a bad environment, let's say with a bad teacher, you're going to respond to that very badly. So that's going to have a real impact on you. But if you're with a wonderful teacher in a wonderful environment, that's going to impact on you very positively as well. But if you're an orchid, but if you're a dandelion, actually it doesn't really make much difference what sort of environment you have. Now, I find that slightly concerning because I don't want to promote this idea too much. Otherwise, I can imagine parents saying, oh, it doesn't matter what I do with my kids because I think they're all dandelions. So I just think we need to be a little bit cautious about this. Embodied cognition is an interesting one. We've known for some time about the enactment effect. Embodied cognition is really saying that you can't think about the way we think separately from the way we act and the way we move, because we've evolved with these two sets of processes working together. I mean, a central organizing principle of the nervous system is that we take in sensory information and we convert it into action. And that's been the case ever since the very first bacteria. Well, we don't know that, but it's certainly for the last couple of billion years it seems to have been the case. On the other hand, no, that's an exaggeration. I say half a billion years, I'd stick some money on that. Half a billion years. So it's been around for quite a long time anyway. But we haven't really understood another effect that we often see, which is, or it's been often reported, whereby a teacher's movements appears to influence whether a student learns or not. So if I was teaching you about particular verbs in a foreign language, and unfortunately my foreign language is not very good, but supposing I was telling you the word for a jump, which completely evades me in French, if I was actually jumping up and down at the same time, for some reason that appears to improve your rate of learning that verb. So what the teacher is doing in terms of their gesture appears to make an impact on learning as well, not just whether you are acting it out. And one way in which we can understand that is through the mirror neuron system, whereby when you watch somebody move, so if you're watching my hands now, then your cortex is activating as if you are moving your hands. And this appears to be a mechanism that supports your understanding of my mind, if you like, helps you get inside my head a little bit. And so we don't know very much about this in terms of education yet, but potentially it gives us a way of understanding some of these vicarious, is that what word? Some of these words, some of these effects, such as how we learn from a teacher's movements and their actions. Right. Another well-known effect is the spacing effect. And the spacing effect is probably the oldest, well, it must be one of the oldest psychological effects we know of. It was discovered by Ebbinghaus in the 19th century. And it really just means that if you're going to teach somebody something, and like I'm trying to teach you now, it would have been better if conditions had practically allowed for it, for me to have given you this information in 10-minute bursts rather than trying to give it to you all at once in an hour's session. Why is that the case? We don't completely understand. There have been several theories. But even though it's an old effect, it's very rarely used in education. And partly that's maybe because we don't understand how it works. Neuroimaging has allowed us to see activation of regions during the spaces of the spacing effect that indicate some sort of unconscious rehearsal of the learning material. So it's possible that unconsciously you're actually repeating this stuff back to you, even though you're doing something else and you're not aware that you're focusing on what you've been learning at all. That sort of creates issues as to what you should be doing during those spaces. And if you are sort of interleaving different types of learning, that appears to improve learning as well. It's called the interleaving effect. But we know even less about that than we do about the spacing effect. Possibly neuroimaging could give us a little bit of a help with that in the future. Testing is one of the best known effects that we have. There are 4 candidates at least as to why testing seems to improve learning. Several of these could be investigated using neuroimaging, but as yet, we have very few studies that have shed light on that, but it's an interesting area for future research. What we do know is that there seems to be a fairly good relationship between the way in which the reward system is activated and declarative memory formation, at least in certain contexts. And that gives us hope that understanding how the brain responds to reward might give us a better impression of how to use reward in the classroom. So, for example, one of the things that we seems to make a difference is the uncertainty of the reward. So if I was offering you a point for a correct answer, that may not be as stimulating for your reward system as if I was offering you the chance of 2 points or no points according to the spin on a wheel of fortune. And so that's, sponsored the development of interventions that I've been involved with, whereby we've been asking children questions, and then the whole class has been responding using mobile phones, not just to the question, but also as to whether they want to gain their points on a wheel of fortune. And we have an intervention which is going on at the moment in schools where children in Year 8 are learning their science entirely through this sort of gaming approach. So every science lesson, there's a half a dozen questions using this sort of approach to motivate and engage with the answering of the question. Some things are a little bit, some of the ideas are a little bit more controversial than that. Neurofeedback is a potentially interesting idea. If we can find cheap ways, mobile ways, and they are getting cheaper and more mobile all the time, to monitor our own neural activity, then perhaps we could develop a better ability to enter certain mind states that are helpful for learning or for performance. So in a study that was done, these images are from a study that was done in the Royal College of Music, which showed use of this neurofeedback to enter a more creative mindset could improve the degree classifications of these music students by a whole point. So if they were going to get a 2-2 in music performance, they found they were getting a 2-1 after using neurofeedback to enter this particular mind state and become more practiced at entering this mind state. And this intervention has now been undertaken as well with similar results in schools. And then there are these sort of modern devices, well, not modern devices, commercial devices that you can already buy on the internet, which are possibly a little bit more dodgy, really. I can't really believe that they work at all, because they've only got one electrode, which is an extremely small number of electrodes for EEG. But, already, I've just put this up here really just to show that already there's a commercial interest in developing these devices. And another type of device, which is also becoming popular, that can be bought on the internet, and I'm certainly not suggesting that you buy it, but it passes a small electrical voltage across your scalp. And this so-called transcranial direct current stimulation appears to improve your cognitive function in certain ways. It first came to the attention, I think it first received a big dose of attention when it was found that military personnel being deployed in Iraq, their training, their rate at which they were learning during their virtual reality training was doubled as a result of applying these sorts of small currents across their head. And my colleague Roy Cohen-Kadosh is now using this to improve children's maths ability, or attempting to. Well, actually, I think he is doing that, actually. I think there has been some good positive results. I have to emphasize these voltages are very, very small, okay, just to be clear. I think what's worrying, though, is the way that you can now pick up sort of DIY manuals on how to connect a 9-volt battery to your head on the internet, and I think I would be extremely wary of those sorts of instructions. Okay. Actually, I was talking to one of my students about this. I said, come along, give us a chat about this. They had to pick a topic, and she did come in the next day with a 9-volt battery strapped to her head. That's why I need to emphasize that's probably not a good idea. But many other areas, memory, the effects of stress on memory, we're beginning to understand a little bit more from the neuroscience, how learners visualize and imitate. When you visualize an action, in fact, you activate almost as much visual cortex as you would as if you were actually undertaking it in reality, which gives you a good steer as to how effective perhaps visualization can be as a learning tool. Working memory training, a bit of controversy around that. We're not quite sure whether it transfers or will transfer to academic achievement or not. I've already mentioned adolescence, many other topics. There are quite a few, as you might already have guessed, however, there are ethical issues involved in this new field as well. Some of them have often catch the attention of journalists in newspapers. Perhaps the most popular one is smart pills, cognitive enhancing drugs, many of which have been produced to help patients with Alzheimer's, but appear to provide some benefit, arguably, to healthy users as well. The most popular prescription-only illegal sort of cognitive enhancer that is used is methylphenidate, and there are some studies in the US that show that quite high percentages, about a third of the students on the campus are doing this in some universities. Is it fair though? Is a GCSE grade achieved with the help of a cognitive enhancing drug worth as much as a GCSE grade achieved without the help of a smart pill? The technological brain enhancement I just showed you, are we concerned about some zero-sum effect here? I mean, is it the case? You don't normally get anything for nothing from nature. Is there a sense in which it might be improving cognitive function in some areas at the expense of reducing it in others? We don't really know that at the moment. So how do we go about testing and finding out? Infant dyslexia screening, we can use EEG now to provide some sort of estimate of the likelihood that a child will go on and develop reading problems. Should we be doing that? Because often, as I've said, where children are disadvantaged, earlier intervention is best. If we can really intervene that early, should we be doing it? Or are we labeling children unnecessarily? Genetic profiling, fitting educational programs to someone's genetic profile. To be honest with you, I think that's becoming less likely as we find out more and more about the complexity of the relationship between cognitive function and genetics. But if it was possible, should we be worrying about data protection? And in terms of collaborative educational neuroscience research, how collaborative is it? Should it be? I think there's a question mark there, really, about how we're proceeding at the moment. It's not very easy to do collaborative work between educational experts and neuroscience experts. Have we got the right approach to it? Because there are challenges for dialogue between those two areas. I've already mentioned differences in language, but also the role of evidence is different. And I think in the recent programme that's been funded by the Wellcome Trust and the Educational Endowment Foundation, where we've got, I'll show you in a minute, 6 programs that are underway in schools, trialling some ideas from neuroscience in education. I think it shows that there's a different role of evidence in science compared with education. In education, evidence has to persuade politicians and it has to persuade educators. And maybe they're less interested in statistically significant, well, what we mean by statistical significance. Maybe they're less interested in measures that are purely scientific, however well focused they are. Perhaps they need measures that are more political, even though they're not scientifically sensitive. I mean, it's just some of the dialogue that's been going on. Different methods used in natural and social science, different professional aims, different communications required as well quite often. I mean, we've had to be very careful with some of the press because if you say we've got educational researchers trialling an intervention with our children, then no one's really going to bat an eyelid at that. But if people get the impression that neuroscientists are doing trials on our children, somehow that suddenly sounds much worse, much more concerning. And ethics are different in neuroscience and education. In education, we often worry about social risks, whereas in neuroscience that tends to be less of an issue. So yes, we have, however, 6 ongoing trials at the moment in schools, funded by the Educational Endowment Foundation and the Wellcome Trust. And you might recognise some of these themes now. Fit to study, looking at the effects of exercise, spaced learning, teen sleep, the impact of sleep education on academic achievement and well-being, learning counterintuitive concepts. The idea here is that when we learn a scientific concept, it doesn't get rid of our preconception. That preconception remains there, and we have to somehow inhibit it. So should we be teaching children to inhibit those naive ideas more explicitly? Graphogame, which is about, well, we looked at graphogame earlier. It's about mapping the phonemes to the orthographic representation, and engaging the brain's reward system, about offering children, this is one that I'm leading, to do with offering children uncertain rewards and using a wheel of fortune in their science lessons. I think I'm getting a little bit low on time, so I've got to be a bit careful here. But just to say that at the moment we have a model of neuroscience entering the classroom which is aligned politically with the ideas that have come out of the Cabinet Office about testing, learning and adapting. I mean, the idea is that you establish the science knowledge, sorry, we don't want that on here. We establish the science knowledge, we develop the interventions, we decide how they're going to be evaluated. It's got to be educationally meaningful criteria, not necessarily scientifically meaningful criteria. Practices and resources interventions are amended in the light of that evaluation, and then you can recommend, if it all works out and you get a good result from your randomized controlled trial, you can recommend those to teachers. But the problems with this is, when do we know that the scientific knowledge is established? Because actually scientific knowledge is changing all the time. When do we, are we really co-designing these with teachers? It's a very difficult collaboration to have, because teachers have so little time. Are RCTs in this context, when I say RCT, sorry, that stands for Randomized Controlled Trials, so it's like the medical model, if you like, of testing drugs being applied to testing these interventions. Are they credible in the context of classrooms? Because teachers don't tend to just do one thing. We've found in our RCT, for example, that teachers are engaging in all sorts of different practices. It also appears to be potentially very expensive if we're going to have to go through these very large RCT trials just to demonstrate that one type of implementation of these ideas works, because when there may be many other types of versions of that implementation that also need to be tested. And ultimately, you're going to come up with something which is going to sound a little bit prescriptive, and I'm not sure it's possible to be very prescriptive to teachers as to what they should do in the classroom. And as an ex-teacher myself and trainer of teachers, I actually am not sure it's a very advisable idea either. So I'm sort of suggesting, really, we should be testing, I won't go into this in detail, but essentially I'm suggesting we should be more testing principles and ideas in more controlled settings, classrooms possibly in a sort of pseudo-experimental sense, but really developing those principles and then giving them to teachers for them to make sense of them with support from scientists, and developing and using them in their own way. And not really sort of pursuing large-scale tests of a single prescription. I think we possibly need to be moving in a different direction now. And this was something that I did, for example, with creativity quite a few years ago, which seemed to work quite well. But I don't think we've got time for that, so I'm going to move on. So essentially, I'm coming around to the idea that really the experts in this field have to be the teachers. And I would agree with Andreas's quote, no education system can be better than the quality of its teachers, except I would actually change that to teaching, because that's the thing we should be focusing on. And as we move towards a greater focus on teaching, the question starts arising, can we really talk about ordinary teaching and learning in the classroom in terms of neuroscience, in terms of scientific processes of learning? And I think that we can, because I think that ordinary everyday teaching, good practice in teaching is what I'm talking about, effective instruction, actually comes down to three basic sets of processes: engaging for learning, constructing thought, and consolidating that learning. And when you break it down in that way, you can begin to see where the scientific principles fit in. And I'm not going to have much time to go into this, but just to say, in terms of engagement, we should be thinking about individual differences, and we can see that and monitor those accordingly. We are beginning to understand how praise and tokens acknowledge achievement, the effects of novelty on the brain's reward system, how that encourages an approach response from learners, and equally how fearfulness and negative emotion can encourage a withdrawal approach, an avoidance approach. We're also beginning to understand, with the help of neuroscience, about the effects of gestures and facial communication, how they communicate emotions consciously and unconsciously, and how that mechanism supports the teacher's transmission of concepts and their enthusiasm. And we're also beginning to understand that the teacher and the student have an important role in constructing the brain's function, connectivity, and even its structure. And that's a very important message to get across, because the plasticity of the brain, the way in which the brain changes as a result of education, really emphasizes that the brain is not a limit to what you can learn. The brain it actually is going to be constructed, but to a large extent, by the opportunities that you provide yourself with in terms of learning. You are, to a large extent, and with the help of your teacher, constructing your brain. And that message of brain plasticity is really important. And there have been at least 2 interventions now that have shown when students know that, in fact, their attitudes and their academic achievement improves. So that seems to be important in terms of engagement. Construction of thought processes, this is possibly the most, in an evolutionary sense, this is probably one of the most recent sets of processes, because it involves conscious construction and connection of stimulus coming in from the outside to what you know already. And that involves regions of the brain which are developing. And therefore, there's an important role here for the teacher in actually helping children in particular, make connections with what they already know. And also, more prosaically, perhaps, the brain is multisensory. We're beginning to understand that even in the auditory cortex, for example, there are neurons that respond to visual stimulus. So it doesn't really make sense to be using only one modality when teaching. Multimodality, and there's plenty of behavioral evidence as well as neuroscientific evidence to suggest is very important for communicating information. And the nice thing about these concepts is that we have images of concrete evidence, if you like, more concrete evidence that these processes are relevant for learning. And then finally, consolidation. We're learning how practice of new knowledge helps it become more automatically accessible. It frees up the brain's limited capacity to pay conscious attention, to be ready for new learning, and that's very important. And in fact, in this study here that was done by Dyslexia, you can actually see this occurring, these frontal regions becoming less activated after practicing and rehearsing your learning, because these are related to working memory. So there's less of a need to be thinking through consciously what you're doing. Instead, these regions, more posterior regions, become active, more active after training, and these are related to thinking automatically. So there's a shift of activity from frontal regions to posterior regions. And also, testing, for example, helps you store knowledge in more different ways. I try to explain this. I'm trying to find a metaphor for this. One of them is what makes a hat useful? Well, what makes a hat useful is having lots of hats for different purposes. And in a way, that's what happens when you keep applying your knowledge in different ways. And we can see that because actually activity related to that concept becomes more variable after teaching, after being tested on that knowledge in different ways. And of course, there's also that importance of a good night's sleep. So I suppose what I'm saying is that for a long time, we've understood some of the psychology of learning, and it hasn't always entered into the educational bloodstream. But now we're beginning with these new neuroimaging techniques to be able to actually see a little bit more in terms of what's happening in terms of the brain. And it provides a more visual and a stronger basis for thinking about learning, I feel. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say. I'm going to skip some of this, but just to say, in conclusion, dialogue between neuroscience and education is a work in progress. There's no established model for neuroscience entering the classroom at the moment. There's still arguments about how that should happen, and I think some of the issues I've brought up have sort of probably indicated to you why that is. it's a source of potential insights, but it's also a source of potential confusion. But I think one of the priorities we should have now is to understand and promote core classroom learning in terms of what is effective practice, using a more scientifically informed model of learning. And that should become part of teacher training and part of professional development. So thank you very much. There is a book, if you're interested, that came out in 2010. But rather than buy that, I would say buy my new books coming out hopefully this year, 2017, which is about evolution of the learning brain, which really tries to explain some of the concepts that I've talked about today in terms of the narrative of how our learning brain actually evolved over deep time. Thank you very much. Have we got time for a couple of questions?
Yeah, we really should.
Excellent.
It'd be criminal
Okay.
not to. I'm mindful of the time, but as you might have just heard me say, it would be criminal not to allow people to ask a few questions, especially given the very thought-provoking talk, but also the thought-provoking nature of the content. There are microphones here, so if anybody wants to ask a question, go to a microphone and please ask, but we don't have much time for questions. Please do.
Thank you, that was a very interesting talk. You mentioned quite a few times the importance of sleep, memory consolidation, etc. And of course, with teenagers, you're fighting against their biology. You might sort of, educate them about sleep, but they are desperate to go to bed later. Would you advocate a shift in school time so you don't have to change what teachers are doing, just change the time that they're doing it?
Well, an interesting question. So they've tried this in the United States, but they shifted it from like about 7:30 to a quarter past 8. And they showed a reduction in sleepiness and less absenteeism. But as yet, we haven't been able to find evidence that it improved academic grades. And of course, that's a lot earlier than children often go to school in this country. And I know that the Teen Sleep Project tried to recruit 100 schools to start their day later and to actually try this out in the UK. But it is so difficult. In the end, they had to abandon that approach because I think they were only able to recruit one school who was actually prepared to change their school day. So in theory, and it's often been proposed, that this should be a good thing to try. But at the moment, we haven't got evidence that it affects academic achievement, only some evidence from the States that it improves well-being.
It's been a long day.
It's been a long day.
It's been a long day for both of us. I think it just remains for me to thank Paul immensely, and I'm sure for you to do the same, for such a thought-provoking and fascinating talk, something that we can replay in our heads tonight when we sleep and wake up in the morning with all those questions that we thought, should have asked that when I had the chance. Again, can we all thank Paul? That was absolutely fascinating.